to you, but perhaps not. So let's go. So this is a picture of the Butler Springs fault and outcrop, and we'll get back to this a little bit later on. So this is one example of a place where we can actually sample the materials of the fault and actually try and understand mineralogically and lithologically what's going on at this particular fault. Butler Springs fault that runs in the woods in far north of California in places where people very rarely go. I get the impression. Anyway, why do you might want to study the faults in Northern California in a nutshell? Number one, they move, and as a geologist who likes to measure things, what I mean by this is they move seismically. They move every day, or at least episodically, if not continuously, without having to have an earthquake to move them. So that means that we can measure them all the time, and that is of interest. And that will be the majority of what I'm talking about today, but there's a couple of other things. Two, the slip rates that we measure geodetically for these faults disagree with the slip rates that geologists measure for these faults. That is an opportunity perhaps to understand something a bit more deep about the Earth system, or maybe it's a need for more measurements, specifically geological ones, I think. And three, these faults can pose statewide risks. So I'll show you one example of faults that could make a really big splash at a whole state by disrupting the state's freshwater supply. So understanding some of these faults is very important for the whole state and its economy. So, okay, number one, these things out of sync. The faults move. So here are a few examples of faults moving. This is my right foot on the Markham fault in the city of Willits, where you can go wander around and find things offset and broken by the fault all over the place. This is the Hayward fault in Fremont, the southern end of the fault where it's moving fastest, and I guess you can get a hint of on echelon cracks and maybe a full scarp forming across this road and projecting towards that house over there. Which, when the first time I went there, they had trouble shutting the garage door. It's very obviously like being mangled. This is the Calaveras fault in Hollister, which is another place where faults and houses intersect. Also the road here, you can see the offset. Yeah, so these are all examples of creep, and you can be a little more. You can make a lot slightly more scientific measurements of the creep. So this is one project I had in collaboration with a nonprofit in Fremont, where we had high school kids going out taking pictures of the curbs that are cut by the Hayward fault. So this is from January 2009. Step forward 18 months, and you get this, and you can flip backwards and forwards, which may be difficult to do on this screen, but you can see if you focus in here that the fault moved about a centimeter between those two images. And we did this with compasses and rulers and log sheets and things, so we actually had very good measurements of what measurements to back this up. And the idea was that we could maybe use simple photography to measure the offsets. Of course, in time since then, we got access to slightly fancier tools for doing photogrammetry and measuring things with photographs. And this is a project led by my former graduate student, Jelen Swiatkowski, who went and did structure from motion photogrammetry on these curves. So these rectangles are the focal planes for all of these, a bunch of photographs that she took of this particular curve, and this is a rendering of the three-dimensional model of the curve made from that. And what you can do is you can do this repeatedly and make point clouds out of these photographs. And in the long run, you can then try and align the point clouds on one side of the fault and see the difference in position of the other side. So these are the two point clouds, color-coded 2016 in yellow, 2017 in blue. And if you look really, really closely, we'll rotate these two point clouds around, and you can see maybe there is a very slight difference in the shade. The yellow seems to be slightly into the screen, the blue slightly out of the screen. You can zoom in even more here. And this is the projection of these two point clouds. And they are separated by about 3 millimeters in this image. But that is the annual creep on the Hayward fault at this location. I'm not going to go into the results, the deep results of this, but we found that, you know, the Hayward fault was split into many small flays at the surface. They all were moving at different speeds at different times. In some years we saw vertical motions, and some years horizontal motions in the same place, suggesting, you know, that there's some mixed mode of movement. But anyway, the Hayward fault is studyable using simple cameras. If you do this with with your phone, probably at this point, those cameras are better than probably the one we were using for this. Anyway, I don't like to do photogrammetry all the time. What I like to do is INSAR. And INSAR is a great technique for measuring displacement of the surface of wide areas. The basic idea is that you have a radar satellite that's orbiting over the Earth, and it takes an image of the ground with radar. And the radar phase is basically related to the distance between the satellite and the ground, the number of wavelengths between you and the ground, which is in principle countable, I suppose, but in practice not. The satellites are orbiting about 700 kilometers above the ground, and the wavelength is about 6 centimeters. Well, that's a lot of phase cycles you have to count. But what you can do is you can track the location of the satellite in orbit, correct for that, and just look for the basic difference in distance, which is the satellite found. Difference one image from another, then all you really get is the extra bit of phase that occurs when the ground moves. And that is what we are looking at. We can make time series of those movements, and we can calculate velocities of those movements. And we get very, very detailed pictures of the velocity of the ground that looks something like this. So this is a data set that I was involved in working on when I was in Berkeley way back in the day. There are 3 different data sets shown here from 3 different tracks of the EOS satellites, which were satellites operated by the European Space Agency in the 90s and 2000s. See, this is the Bay Area grading up into Mendocino County, basically here. And what you can see are different colors, and these are represent different velocities. Red colors indicate velocity where the ground is moving away from the satellite. Radar measurements like this are made in the line of sight direction of the satellite. The direction that the radar is pointing is the direction that we measure things in. So where you have red, the ground is moving away from the satellite. When you have blue, it's moving relatively towards the satellite. In this area down here, because this is the plate boundary zone, and the Pacific plate is basically moving towards Alaska to the northwest. What we are seeing here from this gradient from red to blue across here is the relative motion of the plate boundary zone. And you can see all sorts of other things on top of that, red blobs and blue blobs, which are generally speaking not tectonic things, but things like groundwater and groundwater basins. In this case here, the Geyser's geothermal field.
So how much of this is vertical motion and how much is horizontal motion?
I would say most of the kind of the gradient you see here is horizontal. I think almost all the splotches are vertical movements of one sort or another. Yes, like say, this is the Santa Clara aquifer. These are aquifers around Santa Rosa. This is Geyser's geothermal field. And these red spots around the edge of the bay are land subsidence of some sort, probably from building on fill, which is slowly sinking and compacting. Of course, what I'm interested in is the creep on these faults. So if you zoom in on a couple of these, for example, this is the Hayward fault zoomed in on. You can see that the velocities on one side are one speed. One side of the fault moving at one speed, the other side is moving at a different one. The relative motion is localized right at the fault, which shows that the fault is moving at the surface. And this is the manifestation of fault creep, this slow movement of the faults. It's not just the Hayward fault that's doing it. This is the Concord fault here. Up here, we shall see in a second the Rogers Creek fault, which is work I did actually with Roland when I was here. This more subtle change from sort of yellow to blue across here is another manifestation of that creep. And you can do things like taking profiles through those data, and you can fit lines to the data, and you can measure the offset at the fault, and you can convert that by doing some trigonometry and stuff with vectors into a creep rate estimate. So this early study, we got rates on this section of the Rogers Creek Fault, this block here, from between 3 and 6 millimeters a year. It did turn out that Bob's question is slightly prescient in that some of that motion is probably not fault parallel. It could be vertical. So we did a follow-up study where we used data from 2 vantage points, not just one line of sight like this, but 2. And that gives you the possibility of separating out horizontal and vertical motions. So these are the 2 data sets, or it will be in a second. So you can see here we have what we call a descending data set here and ascending data set here. In this case, the satellite is looking westwards. In this case, the satellite is looking eastwards. Things that are the same color in both are vertical motions. So this thing here is an aquifer, and this is the geysers up here. But you can still see a change of color across the fault here in this data set, which is what we were seeing before. And when we did our analysis, we basically get, I should say this would work for my former student, Li Zhangjin. We still see, if we look at these profiles through the data, we're able to see still offsets in data like so, which we convert into creep rates. And those creep rates can be quite high, but are generally in the order of about 2 to 3 millimeters a year on this section of the script. To my knowledge, it is the first time that really anyone claimed to see an extensive creeping zone on this fault.
That's the Rogers Creek.
Yes, and it still shows up in later data sets. So you might think, well, okay, the Hayward fault's creeping, the Rogers Creek fault's creeping. If you look along fault maps, the next fault along in the system is the Markham fault. Is that creeping? We knew it was in a couple of places from where the Markham fault intersects with human infrastructure, but there were a couple of places spots, the city of Willett, the city of Ukiah. We have now a mission called the Sentinel mission, which is acquiring much more regularly data over these areas with SAR that we can use for this kind of analysis. And the great thing about Sentinel is that it repeats every 12 days over the surface. So we have much more quality data and more of it. The more data you have, the more you can beat down the noise during times of series analysis. More data equals better precision, basically, in our measurements. So Jerlyn, former student, she made a detailed INSAR map of the Markham fault, which will appear on the screen shortly. Here it is. Again, ascending and descending data. And you can see again, over large areas of the fault, a change in color across it. You can see, for example, cooler colors in general in this data set on the west side, warmer colors on the east side. And there are a few places like Willits and Ukiah where we knew there was creep from offset curves and the like, but we were able to fill in a lot of gaps between those, showing that essentially this fault is creeping. And you also see further south more such features in the data down here. So she did something very similar with the profiles through the data. I should say this is the geysers again. Unfortunately, Jerlyn used the opposite color scheme to me when we made her figures. I didn't replot them using red for down. In this case, blue is down. But you see, it's a very, very strong deformation signal always. In all the data we have, it's subsiding. And that turns out to be of interest because when we did the decomposition and estimated the creep rates by taking profiles again and fitting them, see that there are steps in all of these in one data set, and you can often see in the other data set the opposite step, which is also what you'd expect for faults. If the 2 data sets are pointing in different directions, then a positive step in one data set should equal a negative step in the other data set if the motions are horizontal and not vertical, which is what we think. Anyway, when we did that, we can come up with a map of creep basically along the Markham fault. What we see is most of the fault is creeping the rates about 4 to 6 millimeters a year, but there is a zone where it's creeping faster than that. up to about 10 or 11. It turns out that this segment is the segment that's right next to the geysers. And I am curious as to why that might be. I have a few guesses, but right now I'm involved as a graduate student looking at trying to model what influence a contracting geothermal reservoir might have on the stress state of a nearby creeping fault. I think perhaps now spitballing that contraction of a geothermal reservoir might pull on the fault and reduce the normal stress and allow it to slip more. There's also the possibility that there were injections of fluids. There was a stimulation project of the northwest geysers, try and fracture it to create more fractured rocks that you could circulate more water through it to generate more geothermal power. And if any of that fluid broke out, maybe that would also give you a reduced normal stress on the fault. These things are up in air, but this is an interesting possible place where you could investigate the relationship between man-made or human activities and movements of faults without necessarily kicking off a big earthquake when doing so. I hope. Of course, we don't just have to use INSAR to do this. I've increasingly been looking towards seismic evidence for this, and some of this has started off by conversations I had with Bob Nadeau a very long time ago now. And in my case, born out of a slight frustration that INSAR doesn't really image beyond the movements of the surface. So if you're trying to understand what's happening at depth on faults, it's increasingly difficult to do that with INSAR. It's not impossible. INSAR is somewhat sensitive to deeper movements and not just at the surface. But the resolution decreases with depth, and the influence of noise gets larger, and it's very hard to do. So additional information is really useful. And repeating earthquakes are these small earthquakes that occur on creeping faults that seem to occur in the same place every single time, and periodically in the same place at every time. And so the idea is, you have a little stuck patch surrounded by patches or areas of the fault that are moving, kind of gets dragged along by the creep. And so it gets loaded to failure repeatedly over time. And if you can estimate the size of the source and the amount of slip that it has, then you can convert that into a creep rate. So I had a student, Nada Shakibai Senabari, who set to work on this on the Markham fault and Rogers Creek faults. The way that you go about it, if you haven't seen this before, I'm sure you have, is that you look at the similarity of the waveforms from these earthquakes. So if the source of the earthquake is in the same place, and the path of the seismic waves is the same, and the receiver is, the instrument that's recording them is the same, the same type of earthquake each time, all things are the same. These are the three things that contribute to a seismic waveform. So if all three of those things are the same, then the waveforms should be the same. And you can find examples where they are. These waveforms shown here from a repeating earthquake sequence on the Rogers Creek fault are effectively identical. There are long periods of time between these earthquakes too. I think if you look at the repeaters on the Hayward fault or the San Andreas, they tend to recur much more quickly than this. But even so, long interval but identical earthquakes, and you can use that as an example of a repeating earthquake sequence. So one thing we ran into that was problematic in the wild lands far to the north is that the network coverage is not as good as it is on the San Andreas fault or the Hayward fault. It seemed that the USGS renamed or repurposed a lot of the stations so that they changed the channel code and the sample rate and all sorts of other things, so they weren't identical records anymore. That was one problem. And also several stations went offline or new stations came online, and this was a slightly more challenging environment to work in. So what Nada did, he developed a strategy for identifying repeating earthquakes based on pairwise similarity. So if you can't rely on the station being there, being active for the whole time you're looking at, maybe you can still find pairs of earthquakes that are identical. And if you build like a tree of similarity, you can relate earthquakes that were not recorded by the same stations into part of a repeating sequence. So this is an example of that. These three colored earthquakes here, 1, 2, and 3. This is from the double difference catalog that we use as basically our best sort of catalog locations for these events. These were double difference relocated. You see, they do not overlap in the double difference catalog.
Well, that's because they have different coverage, I would imagine.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. These three earthquakes were from 2003, 1994, and 2009. So almost certainly the network was different each time. And they also, I think they use some, not just relative travel times, but absolute travel times as part of their location process, part of it. Anyway, so these waveforms are color-coded by event. You can see it pairs of stations. These earthquakes look identical with high cross-correlation coefficients. We can construct a dendrogram of similarity of these events and all the other ones around there, and show that really only these three have high mutual similarity. 0.94, I think, is the lowest of the cross correlations between those. So when you do this clustering, basically you find your family are the ones with very high similarity, and the ones nearby, while similar, are not that similar. And only one station, these are the stations. Here, only one station, NMC, actually recorded all three of those earthquakes. But we were able to build a repeating earthquake family from the pairwise similarity of the earthquakes at other stations. So we did that, and we found a load of repeaters in Northern California. These are they. They're color-coded by our estimated creep rates based on a calibration we did for a very shallow repeating family that was right on the zone where we see creep in the INSAR and can measure the creep in the INSAR. So the squares with colors are sort of the gold standard. They're very similar waveforms. We did a relocation test to see if their locations were within source radius of each other. And they had periodic repeats or quasi-periodic repeats. We also have events that have very high cross-correlation coefficients that we could not do. We could not verify their locations by relocation tests, and that's partly because the station coverage isn't very good in some of these places, but it might also mean that they're not repeaters. We don't really know. The test failed. And we also have a number of pairs of events that don't have any additional repeats afterwards, but these are at least, I think, 6 months apart or more. So they're not like the doublet events you sometimes get, two earthquakes popping up one after the other. There is a separation in time, and what we don't know is whether or not, if we look for longer, we would find more of them. I guess this is where you need to do a kind of a waveform that was correlating for all of the continuous waveform archive and see if you find more examples of those. Most of the waveforms we're looking at were triggered by a temporary rate increase in amplitude or something like that. And that's the only part of the waveform that was preserved. So anyway, we find creep, where do we find it? We find it on the zone of the Rogers Creek Fault, where we saw it in the INSAR. We see it along much of the Malcolm Fault. We also see it on the Bartlett Springs Fault, which is this fault here. And we accidentally imaged a couple of repeaters on the Hayward Fault offshore.
Is there a gap next to the geysers where your INSAR shows the higher rate? Or well, I guess it's sort of in that northwest corner.
Just slightly to the north, we don't see it here. No, these triangles with high similarity are in that zone. Yeah, that's an interesting thing why we don't see more of them or more frequently.
One thing you can do when you don't have a lot of stations is do the S-P times for two earthquakes. If they get to the same station, then it should have the same S-P time.
Yeah,
yeah,
we do that. I guess I don't have it on here, but yes, that's one of the. We do an S-P time comparison, or delta S-P time. I guess like the differential S-P time. And for the ones that we think are overlapping, that's usually at the order of like a few milliseconds. The threshold that we use is 7 milliseconds, which is a different separation distance of a few 10 millimeters. So if we look along the Markham Fault, this is what the pattern on the fault surface might look like. It's obviously very simplified. So what's interesting is there is this prominent streak in the seismicity that hovers, starts off with about 5 kilometers depth and deepens to the north at 10 kilometers depth. And most of the repeaters we identify are either within that streak or above it. And there's a few places where we see clusters of them.
How long was your observation period?
It's from 1984 to 2018, I think.
Because, you know, where it creeps slower, you get repeaters much farther apart in time.
Yeah.
So,
We do have like some that have inter-event times of 7 or 8 years in some cases.
Were you surprised to see some of these events right at the surface? Very, very shallow.
Not hugely surprised. There's still like 2 or 3 kilometers down. When you plot them in cross section, often they align into a planar trend, which gives you more confidence that they really are on the fault surface. I'll show you a couple of examples of that actually. One of the things we saw when we looked at these is that there was quite a lot of complexity in the pattern in 3 dimensions. For example, this part here shows 2 trends. I mean, obviously, the high quality repeaters are in this trend, which aligns with the surface trace provided with the fault. But you also see a second possible alignment further to the west, which I'm not sure is mapped or recognized at the surface. And then down here towards Cloverdale, again, maybe multiple structures. It's a bit more complicated here. There's an alignment in these, which looks pretty decent, but then there's a few others that are there to the west. So there are a couple of places where there might be some parallel alignments of these in cross-section that could mean multiple active strands. And because they have repeating earthquakes on them, they might be actively creeping, perhaps. I mean, that would be our canonical model of what we think is going on. If you go further north, you see something similar. So at Willits, where we know it's creeping at the surface, you know, I walked there last summer, 2 summers ago. It's fun. Spent an afternoon whilst we're charging our car, looking for the creep features. At this location, we see, you know, an aligned dipping trend of possible repeaters. These are not verified, but, you know, they form a dipping trend that aligns to the surface trace. And I think Bill Ellsworth back in the day identified that the Markham fault might be dipping at about 60 degrees here. You can also look a bit further south, and you see again a complicated pattern. There's a trend that goes this way, but there's also a trend that goes that way. So if you would crudely draw on lines, you might say that's a dipping trend. And this might be a more complicated thing, maybe dipping with a blade coming off of the surface. And it turns out that if you look in the topography of this area near Willits, this is the city of Willits here, and the Markham fault trace that goes right through the center of Willits, which is why it's identified there. If you look up here, the other end of the valley, there is what looks for all the world like a set of fault scarps. It turns out that someone decided to fly this with LiDAR during the Earthscope campaign in 2007. So someone identified this as a possible quaternary fault, well, there was not really any of the databases. But if you draw on where this is where the fault is, it's actually about 5 kilometers inbound from the Markham fault trace. So I think it's possible that this is the surface manifestation of that earthquake trend at depth. So we would assume, I suppose, that this fault should be creeping, although we did not see it. Quite like it, something is going on there. There is one master's thesis from Cal State, Humboldt State University for this being an active quaternary fault. So why put so much effort into understanding where creep is happening? There's a couple of things. One that's shown by this diagram here shows that basically areas of creep are consistently different from areas that are locked that may experience earthquakes. So the best place to look at this is Parkfield, which is a place where lots of people look for earthquake behavior because, you know, we've had a number of large earthquakes, 96 or thereabouts. quasi-periodically through the 20th century and into 2004. And this is a place where John Langdon and Jess Murray did a very detailed study of the old, all the geodetic data that was available historically and in modern. And what they find basically is if you invert all these stations, which some of which are triangulation stations, some of them are trilateration stations, and some of them are GPS, some of them are occupied with different instrumentation at different times. When you do that and you solve for the distribution of creep or the movement on the fault at different times, you get these patterns here. So between 1934 and 1966, the area in the north, this part, was creeping. The area in the south was not. In 1966, there was an earthquake that filled in the gap around where the creep happened. And then from 1966 to 2004, a very similar pattern: creep in the north, no creep in the south. And then 2004, an earthquake happened that filled again coal. So if you take that as an analogy, if you can use creep observations of creep on a fault, so you can use geodetic data and repeating earthquakes to identify where a fault is creeping. You can also identify where those faults are not creeping. And those are the places you should worry about potentially for future earthquakes. That's one thing. And of course, the second thing is you might actually get into an insight into why creep isn't happening at all. If you know where a fault is creeping, you start making comparisons to other things that you can measure. So the geology that you expect to be outcropping along the fault, or other conditions, high fluid pressures, or something else, you can get into potential associations that would explain why that behavior is occurring. So that's what I say here. By mapping a fault where a fault is creeping, we can understand where it's not. And also we can start to look for causes for these creep signals. And where better to do this than here? Because we know the University of California in 1868 was destroyed by an earthquake, along with many other buildings in the Bay Area. This is Mission San Jose, no longer exists. The county courthouse in Alameda County. This is part of San Francisco. 1868 was a fairly big earthquake, not of course the biggest, but was an impactful regional event, and it probably will recur in our lifetimes. So can we say anything about where it will occur based on measurements that we have been making? Well, maybe. We can feed all the data that we have collected over the years. The INSAR data, this is downsampled according to a scheme I came up with. GNSF data collected by Roland's group over the years. Alignment array data, these are surface measurements made using theodolites. We've hung them all into the hopper with a three-dimensional fault model of the fault trace, and you can solve for where the fault is creeping. And where is it creeping? All these colored areas. This is an inverse model. And you can see there's creep in Fremont, creep on the surface, and then a purple slug-shaped thing that's a very low creep rate. The suspicion is that that's the, if we were to come up with a candidate for where an earthquake might happen, it would probably be in there. And this is the kinematic model, so basically I'm just trying to fit the data with this. I've also worked on efforts to maybe make a more, what's the word, more mechanically wise model in which we use a boundary element model, we drive the fault by its long-term slip rate at its base, and the distribution of creep that we get on the fault and the fit of the data is guided by where lock patches are on the fault. So if you put more lock patches on, then the creep rate is lower. If you take them away, it tends to go faster. And I have a scheme, a Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm that basically goes through trying out putting creeping patches in place, lock patches in places, and we let it run a long time. And eventually, what you see happening is the lock patches start to accumulate in the middle of the fault where we think it's locked. And they tend to go away from the ends of the fault where we think it's creeping. And you can look at the ensemble of hundreds of thousands of these models and gain some insight into where creep is likely to be happening and where it isn't. I'm showing the first 2,000 iterations, but I ran it for 1 million, which will take way too long to show in the talk. But I can show you instead the ensemble, the average of 998,000 models. We throw out the first 2,000 because it's the algorithm is kind of testing the waters and figuring out where the creep should be. Okay, so in this case, red colors means not creeping, not locked in any models basically. It's 100% creeping are the red areas. The blue areas and magenta areas are the ones that are more likely to be locked, and the green ones are we can't really tell. It's a 50% chance of it being locked or creeping. You'll see that there are a whole swathe of the fault that we can are fairly confident are not locked. There must be creeping. And the reason for that is if you put one locked patch in the middle here, it would just depress the creep rate all around it. Because these models are, they don't allow like sudden gradients of or very, very sharp boundaries between creep and locking. Creep has to, if you have a creeping patch next to a locked one, then because the locked one is not moving, the patches around it won't move very much either. Yeah.
But isn't that exactly what you see there? Like locked patches just next to creeping patches.
Well, there's usually this boundary of kind of like fuzziness first. I get your point.
There's like magenta next to red.
Yeah, there's a few places, there may be structural complexities, like bends in the fault or something like that, where we don't get too.
All the magenta spots are next
Oh,
to
well,
red.
there's two things to say actually. Okay. These are also places where the surface creep might be low.
Okay.
Like especially around Oakland and Berkeley. If you go and measure it, you go find your local offset curve around the stadium, say, there are still places I think where you can go and see that. The creep rate is low in Berkeley, it's about 2 millimeters a year, whereas down in Fremont it's more like 6 or 7, and same up at Point Canal. Yeah, that's a good point.
Do you have, where are the repeating earthquake locations? Do they jive with this?
Yeah, so any element of the fault where a repeating earthquake happens, I make it a creeping element. So these, this, these are all repeating locations of repeating families, and that does help because obviously, if I say that most of this area is kind of greenish, which means it's 50% chance of being 50% of the model that's creeping, 50% is locked. You put a creeping element next to it, it will add information to the system and allow you to say with greater certainty that other elements are locked. But anyway, like if you delve into this a little bit more, you might see maybe segmentation between maybe an asperity here in the north, maybe, and certainly very likely asperity in the south.
So what's the depth at the bottom?
This is 12 kilometers.
12, okay.
Sorry, I left that off. These elements are mostly like 3 kilometers long,
Okay.
something like that. But you can do the math. And this area of the fault here is accumulated since 1868, equivalent magnitude of about magnitude 6 earthquake. And here, something more like a 6.6 in the zone here. And of course, we also have many different realizations of the locking distribution, right? This is just the ensemble statistic, but there are models where the locking goes mostly across the top, ones where it goes along the bottom, ones where it's very disconnected. In some sense, we need to more work to understand the structure of these different models. We've tried experiments where we try to run dynamic rupture simulations on some of these locking distributions.
So this is how often they turn out to be locked or not. It's not a coupling percentage, right?
Yeah.
Someone has to be careful separating.
Yeah. So with these statistics, basically, those are calculated on each model and then averaged over all the models. They're not, based on this. But they give you some sense. Like, it's quite likely that the locking around Oakland, at least part of it is shallow. From this, because 70% of the models show locking here. It's not a coupling distribution.
Where's Berkeley?
Directly above the
Right above those.
Sorry.
Is that where
I moved to like the San Andreas fault, so like and the San Francisco. So like I have like the two most dangerous faults in California. on my doorstep.
Is that where the 1868 earthquake nucleated?
I don't know where it nucleated. I know that the damage distribution was mostly between Oakland and Fremont. So there were some mentions of possible surface rupture from that, but also the damage was distributed mostly in the stone here. There are a few newspaper accounts and things like that, which were compiled by Jack Boatwright into a shape map, an estimate of the shaking in that earth. Mostly intensity 9 in this zone, which is like damage to masonry building. Things. And as I said, like the original University of California was in Oakland and was destroyed. And that's where.
Excuse me, while we're getting nervous about medical probability. Your definition of repeating earthquake carried back. Again, it had very, very similar waveforms, nearly identical waveforms. And what time frame do you expect that you showed some as long as 7 years apart?
Yeah.
Do we have 150 years apart?
I mean,
And identical is one thing, but what about mirror shaped?
okay, so
So, I mean, how soft can you define a repeating earthquake? Are we talking about a potential repeating earthquake at the Hayward Fault?
yeah, so I think some people in this room have said that the Parkwood earthquakes are repeaters. So maybe magnitude 6. What was interesting actually about the last Parkwood earthquake was it ruptured in the opposite direction to the previous one. So in detail, that waveform would not have looked identical, but the rupture area could have been very similar. And that's another wrinkle that you have to consider when you move to bigger and bigger events. Then the complexity of those events will get larger, will get greater.
And the recurrence times get larger too, as you get to.
Yes. Yeah. So this could be a repeating earthquake, yes. But it need not rupture in the same way as the previous one. But yeah, at some point they cease, well, they just become earthquakes.
Sure.
There's the name that we could call them characteristic earthquakes.
Thank you.
That
I was just gonna say.
is not necessarily a model that everyone holds to, but it may hold well for earthquakes where the rupture zone is confined in some way. I don't know if anyone else has a view on that. Move on. Right. We started to use these in this information on creep distribution and locking distribution and attempts to model scenarios in which multiple faults may rupture or different combinations of fault effects are included. This is a study I contributed some results with Ruth Harris, who tried to model earthquakes in various ways on the Rogers Creek Hayward fault system. Just goes to say that, you know, if you included creep in the model, then it reduced the size of the earthquakes by quite a lot.
That's seismic moment, right?
Yeah.
Not magnitude.
Yes. The seismic moment was about 50% of what it would have been if you let it rip without any kind of reduction in strain accumulation from having the fault creeping. And if you have other effects, like cohesion on the fault, it reduced it even more. And you can also test things like, well, could you get an earthquake that jumps from one to the other? The answer is yes. Usually you need to give it a good run up on the Rogers Creek fault to get going before it jumps across. They didn't seem to jump the other way. But anyway, these are the sort of things you can start to explore if you have a big model that's robust. The other big question you might ask is, why is it happening here, all this creep, especially since like most faults don't do this. Of course, the more you look, the more examples you do tend to find, but it's still not common behavior of faults. But seemingly in this part of the world, it seems to occur quite a lot. Well, all these purple splotches on this map, and there are lots of them, are outcrops of serpentinite, California state rock. And some people have suggested that, you know, there are serpentinites sort of pervasively across the region that were accreted to the continent over the last 100 million years or so, with a persistent subduction zone offshore. This purple material is the Coast Range ophiolite. This is a figure from a paper by Diane Moore. that suggest that, well, one reason we see creep on the Markham and Bartlett Springs faults in North Bay is that basically these faults tap into this Coast Range ophiolite material. And because serpentinite is very weak and actually can be squeezed and injected in some cases, there are examples apparently of serpentinite glaciers and other things like that. Perhaps the serpentinite is intruding along these fault surfaces, which are weaknesses in the crust. And so like the faults are actually sort of being sought out by the material that allows them to creep. Diane's done a lot of interesting work showing that if you have serpentinite material between two feldspathic blocks, it tends to be much weaker than serpentinite and serpentinite contacts. So like serpentinite injected through more felsic rocks tends to give you a very low friction coefficient. So one example is here. I showed you this picture before. This is a picture from Jim Campers' work on the Bartlett Springs fault. There is basically serpentinite here. The light gouge is antigarite on the serpentine. The dark gouge is a decomposed version of that. Antigarite goes to tremolite, chlorite, and talc. The talc is the weakest mineral. So anything that has significant amounts of talc in it is going to be weak. And as part of a PhD, Gerlin, my student, looked at these gouges. What we know from other evidence is that there are repeaters at this location, Lake Pillsbury, very shallow ones. We also looked at the INSAR and we do see an offset in the INSAR at this location, so it probably is creeping at the surface. Also by that photograph, there's creek damage to the road. Anyway, if you do an experiment on this, you drive it between two, smear the gouge on a cut in 2 blocks of rock and drive it with a hydraulic press. You can measure the frictional strength of the gouge. And what Gerlin found when she worked with this and with Diane and Dave Lochner at the USGS was indeed that the gouge was very weak. This is the coefficient of friction here. Hovering around between 0.15 and 0.25, it's pretty low. And also it's velocity strengthening. So if what's shown at the bottom here is the speed of the press was operating at, and the speed goes down, speed goes up, down, and up. And every time you see the speed go down, the strength goes down. Every time you see the speed go up, the strength goes up. That is the manifestation of what we call velocity strengthening friction, which is to say, it's happier moving slowly than quickly, because the faster you try and make it move, the more it wants to resist you. This is a frictional condition which is consistent with creep, because obviously slow movement is favored over fast movement. The opposite condition, velocity weakening, is typically associated with very unstable rapid slip, which is so weak and velocity strengthening. So the Bartlett Springs fault are doing this. Mineralogically, or in terms of the chemical composition, it's very similar to the gouges found at the San Andreas Fault Observatory at depth, safe project where they cored through the creeping San Andreas. We're able to sample that stuff. Here endeth the creep lesson. A couple of other things to mention about Northern California faults. Estimates of their slip rates disagree between different methods. So on the left, we have sites that were sampled geologically for the last USERP report. So these decadal sort of reports on the likelihood of earthquakes in different parts of the state. On the right are GNSS velocities from a compilation put together for that purpose. One couple of things to notice. Okay, this is the area we're interested in. This is another area that people are interested in. There are a lot more points, so sample locations in this box than there are in this one. Also, a lot more vectors in this box than that one. This is a manifestation of something I think we should work against. Is that the North has been neglected, but not by me. I have been doing my bit to add to the number of GNSS vectors in the northern box. This was us last summer. My collaborator, Mike Floyd from MIT, plus 2 of my graduate students, Carly and Norma. We went out and we measured in, as I say, extremely inhospitable temperatures in Northern California got hot that week. What we've been trying to do is basically fill in the gap in this area. This area had very few continuous stations. Of course, some of the few ones they did have were Berkeley's. The PBO project from UNAVCO and EarthScope filled in more. But all these colored dots are ones that we have contributed to the cause. So we have densified the coverage in this part of the world substantially, which is good. And you can invert those velocities, maybe along the profile, to get the slip rates of these major faults. So there's the profile and there's the fit. And here are some histograms of our estimated creep rates. See, we get a rate about 19 millimeters a year for the San Andreas fault, plus or minus half, about 10 and a half for the Rogers Creek, 9 for the Green Valley fault. But if you compare that to the geology rates from the USED report, they get 24 on the San Andreas and 9 and 4 for these faults. So there is a discrepancy between what we find and what they find. They being the geologists. I don't want to make them sound like a group of others. Some of my friends, obviously, but there is a difference between what we see, and there are questions about, well, they could both be right because they're measuring things on different timescales. Geology is usually over thousands to tens of thousands of years, whereas geodesy is very definitely the last 30 or less. But anyway, it's not just me that sees this.
If I add up these numbers, it looks like the sum at least is about this.
The sum is about the same. It's about 38 to 40, yeah, which is encouraging to some degree. But yeah, could it be that they're both right, but they're just different timescales, or there's some time-dependent process that's going on, or is it something else? We don't know, but we should look at it. I should say that it's not just us that see this. In the last USEC report, there was an effort to model GNSS velocities with a block model, or actually multiple groups with different models, to try and estimate what the rates that geodesy agreed on for the faults. And there is a blue line, which is kind of hard to see, but it's here, which is this is the San Andreas slip rate for the North Coastal segment. So basically, this scenario I just showed you. They get 16 millimeters a year, 5 different models averaged together. So they actually get a lower rate than we do. So it's not just us that have this persistent difference. And in this particular case, the difference between 16 and 24 is 50%. There's a huge difference in creep rate. And this is not the only place where it's observed, but it's probably the most dramatic. So anyway, this is another thing that we ought to figure out.
So geologic rates include seismic.
That include earthquakes for sure.
Yeah, they
Hundreds
include,
probably of earthquakes in some cases.
yeah, so they include, the geodetic doesn't necessarily include
Correct.
the locked part of the,
Yeah,
Well-
we are. Yeah, so if the rates change over an earthquake cycle, that would be one reason why they wouldn't agree. But there could be other reasons. But it's hard to see why lower in some and higher in others, unless they're they're different stages of the earthquakes. I don't know. Challenge to people who model these things to figure out better models. The third thing I wanted to mention is that these earthquakes can pose statewide risks. And what's a better place to illustrate this than the Sacramento Delta, which, according to this California Department of Water Resources page, is a picturesque area. The hub of California's water supply, supplying 2/3 of the state's population with fresh water and millions of 3 to 4 million acres of farmland. How you draw it up. So like 25 million people get their water supply from water that's pumped basically from the Sierras through the Delta through a series of channels into aqueducts, which then cut most of it to Southern California, but some of it to the Bay Area. So an earthquake here that damaged this delicate system of levees could be really bad, because it turns out that the channels that are used for the water supply are right next to sort of basically estuarine brackish water that is intruded from the sea all the way up to the edge of the delta area. And so disruption to the levees could mean that the water supply is spoiled. And even if that's repairable in the long term, it certainly will be very disastrous in the short term.
So they need to retrofit the levees.
They do, and the levees, unfortunately, are subsiding all on their own due to a process of peat oxidation. So this was once all a salt marsh. The levees were once active marshlands. There's a lot of peat accumulated there, so decomposed plant matter. The microbes are slowly oxidizing and turning to carbon dioxide. And when the carbon dioxide escapes, you have a net loss of material from the levee. So the levee subsides. It's not good. So this is a map of areas that are at risk of liquefaction from earthquakes. You can see that there's a lot of pink out here, which is the delta area. The only reason the map stops here is that there's a county boundary, not because the liquefaction hasn't stopped. This data set just was the 9 counties of the Bay Area. That's bad. And also what's bad is that here in the eastern part of Bay Area, so Antioch here, Davis is over here. There is this fault that goes through the levee system called the Midland Fault, which has identified reflection seismic profiles used for gas exploration in this area. It's a blind thrust fault underneath basically the western part of the delta. Oops. There are also suggestions that this fault here, the West Tracy fault, should be active. There may be active faults in these zones because these are like higher than average areas of ground. The Montezuma Hills are hills. They're surrounded by basically mud. So why are they up there? Probably something tectonic. So all this is bad. And historic GPS data also shows that there probably is contraction across this area. So this is the plate boundary perpendicular velocity. This is the Bay Area. This is the Great Valley, and the zone in between is where we are looking. There is, in this it says 4 millimeters a year of contraction, although I understand that Matt D'Alessio worked on this and it may not be that high, but it's still non-zero through here. So part of our campaign was out in this wonderful part of the world. This is Montezuma Slough near the Montezuma Hills. Norma is doing something to the future in there. And we measured as many of the stable benchmarks as we could find. These were usually on bridge abutments or in areas of more stable substrate. So we take our velocity map that looked like this and we add some more stations to it out in the east. And the interesting thing I see about that is they seem to be pointing in a different direction to the others, kind of that way, to the northeast, which is more or less perpendicular to the trace of the Midland Fault, although I admit that there are some large uncertainties in some of these and they don't all pointing in the same direction. But this is basically from the comparison between a campaign that the California Department of Water Resources made in 2011 and our data from last summer. So there's only 2 measurements of each of these velocities. They could be refined significantly in that we measured them in a couple of years. But anyway, likelihood is that this fault could be, at least these data do not discount the possibility of this fault being active, because this wouldn't be the sort of the sense of motion we would expect for an active reverse fault in that location. One other thing to point out is that perhaps this fault here, which is the Kirby Hills Pittsburgh fault, Pittsburgh Kirby Hills fault, could be the marker of a sort of change of behavior across the zone. This could be the end of like non-plate boundary parallel movement, transition to something else. There's people at the USGS who turned me onto that and said, think about that. So sure, that's quite possible. So that's all I have for you. Just to say, there are 3 reasons I think why Northern California faults might be interesting. Several of the faults creep, and this raises lots of questions like why here? What's the cause? What's the mechanism? How does this affect seismic rupture? How does it affect seismic hazard in general? The geologic and geodetic rates of slip of these faults or estimates of them differ. do we need more data to reconcile this? Do we need better models to reconcile this? Are they both right, or is one of them wrong? And finally, and that's what here, that's statewide consequences. So we really do need to do more work out east to try and figure out what the seismic hazard is there, because let's say like even a small earthquake that causes liquefaction would be catastrophic in the sort of the short to medium term. Thank you for your time.
Questions?
Is there, in Southern California, are they after slip that occurs on these large earthquakes?